Last time we were talking about these sparse coding models, and they were just applied to static images. And so there's lots of different ways you can extend this model to time-varying images. One way that people have done it is just by doing blocked ICA or block sparse coding, where you take a group of frames and then just treat that as a bigger data vector, and simply basically treating time as another dimension. And but the way we approach this problem is by using a convolution model over time, so that you can learn a set of localized space-time kernels that are convolved with a set of sparse coefficients to generate the dynamical structure of a movie. So the generative model is shown down here, describing the time-varying image as a convolution of their sparse latent variables with these space-time functions. So that vastly reduces the number of spatiotemporal functions that you need to learn in this case, because all you have to do is tile the spatial dimension, and then you don't have to repeat these functions at different points in time as you would in a blocked scheme. And so this is just showing you the solution you get from that. Some of the kernels, each row is showing you a different basis function, phi sub I, that's a function of time going from left to right. And these are more easily visualized, obviously, if you play them as an animation. So in this case, the basis functions were simply 7 frames in time, 12 by 12 in space, and 7 frames in time. And I'm just playing each basis function over and over again in a movie. And if you're subject to seizures, then you probably shouldn't look at this, or I shouldn't put that up too long. But anyways, so the idea here is that you learn a full set of functions that tile now not just position and orientation, but also all the different directions and different speeds of motion, and different scales as well. So some of that is shown here. So each dot here is indicating a different learned basis function, and just showing you how they tile the joint domain of direction. So the angle in this space is the direction selectivity of the unit, and then the radius is their speed selectivity. So some of those different functions are moving at different speeds. Okay, and it's important to note that this set forms a complete code, a complete encoding of the image. And so we've always had aspirations to use this for video compression. It's something I'm still interested in pursuing. But so this is just showing kind of a brute force demonstration of taking an image, breaking it up into a set of non-overlapping 12 by 12 blocks, and then coding it up with that learned transform. And this is just showing the reconstruction here. And this is just then showing the encoding of that movie in terms of the sparse coefficients, which are being convolved. So the way you get this movie back is by taking these sparse coefficients and convolving with the basis functions to get the movie back. Okay, and this corresponds also to a property of V1 receptive fields, that they're not just static entities, but they also change over time. They have each of these V1 neurons has some kind of a space-time kernel that you can map out, and many of these V1 neurons have kernels that basically look like a Gabor function that's kind of drifting over time. So yeah.
Is there any sort of compression going on, or is that
Oh yeah, definitely. Oh, absolutely. It's very, very much more compressed. I mean, this is a much easier, more compressed signal, lots of zeros in there. The key is you have to beat MPEG if you want to convince an engineer that, somebody in the video coding community, that this is going to be useful. And that's very, very hard to do, because people have sort of engineered the heck out of MPEG. And it's kind of frustrating, because the MPEG coding scheme is not a very intelligent kind of, there's not much of the representation there. There's nothing that's particularly adapted to image statistics. But it's sort of more brute force and the entropy coding and things like that makes it a lot of what makes it work, a lot of sort of clever tricks. And so it's very hard to, at best we can do about as good as MPEG. But I think if we play the right set of tricks, we can hopefully do better. But it's another research project. That's all I'm saying. So the model's also been extended to other domains of color and disparity. So the input that's coming into V1, it changes over time, but it's also the signals are coming in different wavelength bands, right? So the geniculate fibers are preserving information about which cones they're getting input from in the retina, which color selectivities, and also which eye they're coming from. So some people have tried to extend these models in that domain. Some earlier work by Thomas Wachtler in Tibon Lee and Terry Sanowski's lab, and this is sort of early days of their results. But one of the things they found is that when you do this, that the higher spatial frequency functions, the more localized functions, tend to be illuminance only, and the color componency only comes in the lower spatial frequency components. And I'm sure you've seen Marco Aurelio's results, which I think are probably the most beautiful so far in that domain of sort of tiling that joint space. And this is so results from Appo's lab, Appo Huvarinen, where he just trained ICA on the joint images from the left and right eye, concatenating them like what was mentioned in the previous talk. And but as was mentioned, if all you do is concatenate them and you just train on that concatenated vector, well, you get something. And what Appo showed is you get, you sort of learn pairs of Gabor filters, which are sort of, each pair of patches you hear showing a left and right eye input. They're related by a shift, and different Gabors have, different pairs have different shifts to them. But it's not really coding disparity. In order to really code disparity, you have to do something multiplicative in the combination rule. Okay, so and then so the last aspect I wanted to mention about these sparse coding models is that the nature of the encoding is highly nonlinear, especially as you go to overcomplete codes. So you're not computing the output of this code simply by computing the inner product of a basis function with the image. The value of a coefficient is determined by a network computation. Basically, any given unit has to communicate with other units to figure out how it's computed, and that's the result of minimizing this sparse coding objective. And unfortunately, I didn't write it down. I should have, but as you've probably seen in other talks, it's basically a combination of an L2 quadratic penalty between the image and the model, the sum of basis functions, sum of the coefficients, together with a cost function of the coefficients, which is oftentimes something like an L1 cost function. And of course, there's no closed form solution to this, but it results in a nonlinear mapping from the images to the coefficients, even though the generative model is linear, right? The generative model is linear, but the mapping from images to coefficients can be highly nonlinear. And there are some very efficient ways of computing this, computing the coefficients, and one in particular I'll highlight here is the work I did with Chris Rozelle, where we showed that you can compute these coefficients very efficiently in a network implementation that basically is a Hopfield net. It's the exact same equation as a Hopfield network. The only thing that's different is the choice of nonlinearity. So in a Hopfield network, you use these sigmoidal nonlinearities, and you have a bunch of leaky integrators, and the whole network settles in this recurrent computation. And the only difference here is you use this kind of thresholding nonlinearity. And it turns out that this network exactly solves the L1 minimization problem of sparse coding. So the result is that now, as I mentioned, each one of these coefficients is now a linear function of the input. And the nature of those nonlinearities is that it does a form of explaining away. So the idea of explaining away is sort of shown here kind of in a cartoon form. Imagine you have two different units with different basis functions that are sort of related in position, near each other in position, but maybe slightly different orientations. If you come along with an edge like this, that's best aligned to this vertical Gabor, but less aligned with the sort of more oblique Gabor, then the unit that's most aligned with the image is going to respond the most. But the thing that's different from just computing inner products, if you just computed inner products, then this oblique unit with the oblique receptive field would sort of have a partial response. But when you do this explaining away, then this guy is going to try to inhibit that guy, sort of saying, look, I explain the image best. I don't need you to explain the image. Okay, so that's going to happen as part of this sort of nonlinear computation and computing the sparse coefficients. So one question we've been interested in for a long time is, can you see evidence for these explaining away nonlinearities in the population activity of V1 neurons? And so this is part of what we've been looking at with Charlie Gray in experiments in his lab, where we're looking at the joint activity of multiple units that are near each other. And one thing we can say, to, at least to first order, is that the responses tend to be more decorrelated than you would expect, given the inner product between the receptive fields. But whether that are you still have sort of that doesn't sort of necessarily prove this model. And how exactly to prove it is sort of a difficult problem, because you'd have to record from a very large population of neurons. But at least it's consistent with that idea. And also, Andrew Ng did some really nice work in his lab together with Honglak Lee, and also Chris Rozelle and his student Mengchen Zhu showed that a lot of these classic nonlinearities you see in V1 simple cells and also complex cells actually just emerge out of this sparse coding explaining away nonlinearity. And so there's sort of these classic effects like end stopping. So end stopping is the phenomenon where if you put a bar, sort of position a bar over a receptive field of a V1 neuron, and that's matched the orientation of that neuron, you'll get a large response. But now if you make the bar longer, if you make the bar more elongated, keeping the position the same, then the response of the cell actually goes down. Okay, so somehow there's something what people call the extra classical receptive field that attenuates the response of the neuron. And so that's called end stopping. And so you get a similar phenomenon out of a sparse coding network. And one reason why you might imagine this is happening, because you have basis functions there that have sort of different lengths to them. Some are sort of short and stubby, and some are more elongated, as you saw before. And so if you come along with an edge or a bar that's more elongated and matches one of the more elongated functions, then that's going to try to inhibit the shorter function, right? A function that has sort of that's less elongated. And you see that kind of effect borne out. Also this phenomenon of contrast invariant orientation tuning, so where neurons basically maintain the narrowness of their tuning despite changes in gain. That's another phenomenon that you see emerge from explaining away in sparse coding, and then also this phenomenon of surround suppression. So they have a really nice paper coming out of that, which should be coming out soon, but it was presented at Cosine a while back. And then finally, just to, question?
Question. So this experimental user response is smooth, the change, in the non-classical receptive field.
You mean like end stopping?
Yeah.
Is it smooth, or is it you mean like abrupt cutoff? It's smooth, yeah. It's not like you make it a certain length and all of a sudden kapow, it goes.
From this picture, it has to be not smooth, right?
Whoops.
From the explaining away picture.
Hold on. Why do you say that?
Because the coefficients just because of your.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because, yeah, right. The way I sort of explained it here, you would expect sort of like a catastrophic.
Exactly.
Well, okay, this is a cartoon. So you'd actually have to look at it. I mean, if you were really close like this, then it just wouldn't respond at all, right? But what you really want to watch is like as you. I mean, I'm just showing one particular condition, right, and where it completely cancels it out. But you're going to have some intermediate regime there where both are responding, potentially. You wouldn't expect one to just all of a sudden cancel the other. Yeah, but you'd have to kind of look at that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but that's a good question. That's another thing I guess you'd want to look at. Okay, and then the final thing to mention is that there's a whole other class of related models that do not have explaining away. So the energy-based model, and you can think of ICA, basically square ICA, where you have just as many outputs as inputs, as a special case of the energy-based model, where there is no explaining away. The output is simply a linear transform of the inputs. And so in these energy-based models that Simon Asendero explained it, or is the so-called product of T distribution models, POT models. This is just showing you some of the solutions you get out at 1 times over complete, and here at 2.4 times over complete. So as you go to higher degrees of overcompleteness here, the representation is still just linear, right? You're still computing just a whole bunch of linear projections. But what's kind of interesting about that is these actually make a better model of natural scenes than just simply having an overcomplete linear generative model, as I showed you before. And so Lucas Theis has some nice results on this. So it's kind of intriguing that, as with an overcomplete generative model, as you go to higher degrees of overcompleteness, the code becomes ever more nonlinear, and you're sort of exploiting these higher degrees of overcompleteness to sort of specialize the code elements. Here in the energy-based model, you're just sort of computing more inner products, and as you add more filters, the one way to think about what it's doing is that you're just adding more constraints to the probability distribution. So every time you add a filter, you're saying don't be like this, right? You want the energy to be low for this function. So you're sort of adding constraints to the joint PDF every time you put a filter in. And so interestingly, as you make these models more and more overcomplete, you get better image synthesis, better looking images from the models. But as a representation, it's kind of curious because it's still just a linear code, right? You just have a whole bunch of linear filter outputs. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that myself, but just present it as a conundrum. So what I wanted to go on and talk about today are these two topics of group sparse coding models and hierarchical models, trying to basically sort of exploit multiple layers of representation. So, so this whole idea of group sparse coding is basically motivated by the idea that if you look at the outputs of a sparse code, or especially an overcomplete sparse code, you'll find that these elements, they're certainly not statistically independent. And even though in the original model, by virtue of taking a sum in the cost function, by sort of taking a sum of penalties on each of the units, you're basically implicitly imposing a factorial prior. In terms of a probabilistic model, you're imposing a factorial prior, assuming independence among the coefficients. They don't turn out to be statistically independent. So there's loads of statistical dependencies among these units. And so the question is, well, what do you want to do about this? How to model this structure? So one of the first people to observe the form of these dependencies, it was Hierarchical and Shelley, and he characterized them in what he calls the bowtie distributions. If you just look at the joint distribution of a pair of Gabor functions, for example, from a wavelet transform. So in this case, the Gabor functions are really Gabor-like from a wavelet transform. They're orthogonal, so there's no linear correlations in the coefficients. But nevertheless, there's correlations in the magnitude. And so Ira is showing here, what he's plotting here is each column is showing you the probability distribution of this unit's activity conditioned on this unit's activity here. So the X just simply denotes the position of these filters. So this is a filter that's slightly displaced to the right of this one. Okay, and this is a filter that's displaced to the right but orthogonal, at orthogonal orientation. Okay, so you can see that these bowtie dependencies extend quite a ways out. Okay, so you have these common magnitude dependencies. And Christoph Zecchi also discussed these and characterized them. And if you, instead of normalizing each column here to make a probability distribution, if you instead just leave it in its native form as a joint distribution, what you'll find is that the joint distribution of these coefficients is circularly symmetric. And that's as compared to this kind of cross-shaped distribution that you would expect if they were statistically independent. So if each of the variables is sparse, it has a histogram which is highly peaked at 0 with heavy tails, then if those two units were independent, then you would expect this kind of star-shaped distribution as the joint. But instead, what you see, you do see this if you have two Gabor functions which are kind of at completely different parts of the image patch, very, very far apart. But if they start to get close to each other, have similar positions or orientations, then you see the circularly symmetric distributions. And this is kind of a curious distribution because typically we're used to sort of, when we see things that are circularly symmetric, we sort of think, oh, that means it's independent. It's isotropic, it's like a Gaussian. But in this case, it's important to remember it's non-Gaussian, right? It's a highly non-Gaussian distribution. It's highly peaked at 0. The marginals of each of these variables is highly non-Gaussian, yet it's still circularly symmetric. So that's sort of the signature of the statistical dependency you see here. So the question is, what do you want to do about that? What should the cortex do about it? And so one answer that Iro Simoncelli and Odelia Schwartz proposed in 2001 is this idea of divisive normalization, that following this principle of redundancy reduction, you want to get rid of this dependency, right? To the extent that you see dependencies among these neighboring oriented filters, then you want to remove those dependencies and make a more efficient code and so forth. So the way they propose to do that, since these dependencies, they're not simply linear correlations, they're dependencies in the magnitudes of these filter outputs, they basically propose dividing the response of one unit by the sums of squares of responses of other units. So that's shown here. Basically, you take each of these filter outputs, you square its response, and then that basically, you use that to divide out from the response of another neuron, which is in turn getting a whole bunch of other units, and then that would be sort of the result. And so if you look now at these two units, which are sort of normalized by other units in the population, then you see that it removes these common magnitude fluctuations. You no longer have these bow ties that are present. Okay, so that's one answer, is to remove the dependencies. Another answer, I think, is sort of suggested by this work of Aapo Huuvarinen in a paper that is very curiously titled Bubbles. Right? That's the name of the paper, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It's a really great paper. It was very inspirational to me in sort of thinking about the forms of structure that are present in these codes. And it's also described in his book. You may know about Aapo's book on natural image statistics, and it's discussed in there. So what Aapo is showing here is the response of an ICA filter, or same thing with a sparse coding filter. If you look at one of those coefficients in a sparse code that was simply learned on static images, okay, you learn it on static images, and now you play a movie through the system, okay? And now you're looking at the responses of any given coefficient in the code over time. What you find is what he described as this kind of bubble-like behavior. So the response is indeed sparse. It spends most of its time around 0. But then when it responds, it kind of responds in a burst here. Okay? It doesn't just kind of respond in a punctate manner over time. It kind of responds in a burst. Okay? It does something all at once, and then it stays silent. Then it does something again and sort of undulates, and then it's quiet again. So what Aapo proposed here is that maybe a more efficient way of describing what's going on in these coefficient activities is to think of them as being the product of a smooth or slowly changing envelope variable, amplitude variable over time, multiplied by a more quickly changing variable that one maybe think of like a carrier, like an AM modulation. It's not necessarily at a single frequency or something like that. It's just a very sort of fast changing variable, not slow and smooth like this. Okay, so that would be maybe a more efficient way of characterizing what's going on. So this key idea there is sort of proposing then sort of a factorization model. And this is, as you might also expect, is kind of alluding to a lot of the ideas that Roland was just talking about in the previous talk. Okay, and so one might ask, well, why is this coming about? Why are you getting these this bubble-like behavior coming out of images? And one way of thinking about it is that is what we're doing, what we have in our code is basically a linear generative model, right? We're asking our system to describe what's going on in the world as a superposition of basis functions. These functions that come out are sort of edge-like, right? They're sort of oriented at different positions and so forth. But they're never going to be exactly matched, or rarely are they going to be exactly matched to an edge that you see in an image, right? When you give me an image that has some edge in it, it's highly improbable that it's going to match exactly any one of the basis functions I have in my vocabulary. So more likely than not, I'm going to have to add together a number of functions in order to describe that edge. So one way of thinking about the solution we get from sparse coding is really learning a good set of interpolation functions, right? A good set of functions for interpolating images, right? So what the world gives you is edges that occur along a continuum of positions, and you're learning a good basis set that allows you to describe this continuum of things as a superposition of functions. Okay? So the way that rears itself when you have a set of Gabor functions, if you have like an edge passing over a pair of Gabor functions, one centered here, another centered here, never mind the fact that they're sort of displaced vertically, that's just to show them. Then at this particular position, you're going to see maximal activation on this guy's coefficient, and as it moves over to the right, then you're going to see more activation on this guy's coefficient, less on this coefficient, right? So if you look in the joint space of these coefficients, what you're going to see is their activity moving in a kind of curved trajectory. Okay? So that's one way to think about what's happening, is that you have sort of the groups of basis functions groups of coefficients responding to an edge moving over their basis functions. And so as an edge moves over, it's sort of any one coefficient is kind of undulate in a bubble-like fashion. And another way of sort of thinking about this, there was some discussion of manifolds earlier, is that these image patches you can think of as a point in a high-dimensional space. And we know that these image patches fill a very small fraction of the space of all possible images. And we know that it doesn't fill that space in a very punctate way. It's not like a bunch of little spots or dots in that space, points in that space. It's sort of a contiguous It's a contiguous space because any given image can change over time in a smooth and continuous way. Okay, so when sort of imagine sort of a cartoon diagram, you have these manifolds that are embedded in the high dimensional space of images. And one way to think about what this sparse code is doing is basically forcing the system to point its code vectors or its basis functions towards the manifold. Okay, so the sparsity is basically what's forcing these basis functions to point to where the data is. Okay, and now once you've done that, any given point along the manifold is being described usually as a linear superposition of some small number of basis functions, right? You can think of that, what you're doing is sort of doing like a local linear approximation to some part of the manifold using a set of your basis functions. You can think of the sparse code as a union of simplices, okay? At any given time, you have a sort of simplex that's formed by a set of basis functions in this space, okay? So that's one way to think about what's going on. So what's missing from this picture, though, is that we're not explicitly describing that interpolation process in our model, right? In our model, all we have is this term that simply says be sparse, but there's nothing that says how these units should cooperate together in order to form an image. And what you would find if you look at this code is that some of these basis functions cooperate together in a kind of to interpolate points in the manifold, and others don't. Okay, so we somehow have to incorporate that group structure in our model. That's what's missing. So one way that's been proposed for doing that is these so-called group sparse coding models. And as far as I know, Oppo was the first to propose this. And the idea is to take these ICA filters that you get and group them into subspaces. And so take the outputs, for example, of a group of 4 here, square their outputs, sum it together, and say that you want this variable here to be sparse. So what you're saying then is you don't care about how sparse these guys are within the group. They're not going to be forced to compete with each other, but you want the whole set of amplitudes coming out of these subspaces to be sparse. Okay? So it's imposing now a group structure on these basis functions and saying that these 4 basis functions cooperate together as a group, and they're allowed to interpolate. Okay? And these guys aren't allowed to interpolate and so forth with each other. They cooperate as a group, but you're sparse between groups. So when you impose that kind of learning, then you find groups of basis functions or filters that come out that are related in position orientation. So each group of 4 patches here is showing you the subspaces that are learned in subspace ICA. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, then you can also do this in a topographic model. Instead of having non-overlapping subspaces, you could have overlapping subspaces and arrange those in a 2-dimensional map, and you get these kinds of nice topographic maps out of the model. And so interestingly, so Oppo and other people have kind of motivated these models as ways of deriving complex cells and getting topographic maps and sort of being more biological. But I guess in my own view, that shouldn't really be the motivation for doing it, because God knows what complex cells are really doing. And so that could just sort of be a moving target. I think the real reason why this is an interesting model, these subspace sparse coding models are interesting, is because they're just better models of natural images, right? So it's just a better way of modeling the data and capturing its structure. Okay, so yet another form of dependency that one sees in the data is due to contours and more elongated kinds of structures in images, what people in psychophysics and neurophysiology sometimes refer to as an association field. And I think David Field was the one to coin this term. And so what Bill Geisler did is to try to characterize these sort of association field statistics due to contours by simply looking at the conditional distribution of one filter's response given another filter's response. So what he's showing here is the conditional distribution. He's sort of done 2 different ways. Actually, probably the best one to look at here. So if you condition it on a unit in the center here that's oriented horizontally, being on. So if this filter that's oriented horizontally is active, then what you're looking at here is what's the relative probability of any other filter being active at that given position and at orientation. The orientation is indicated by the orientation of the line shown here. So basically what you can see is that very close to the unit, then you see this kind of collinear kind of dependency. And if you normalize that in a different way, what you see then, you get this kind of what he called the co-circular dependency, where you find a bunch of edge elements here that tend to lie on common circles. okay? And this sort of just all falls out of the statistics of contours as they appear in natural scenes. So one idea that people have proposed is that maybe this is what horizontal connections in the cortex are doing, right? So in V1, these oriented units have fibers that stretch over long distances of cortex, in fact, many millimeters. Okay, so any given oriented unit is talking to other oriented units that can be very far away in position potentially. And so, well, what are those two neurons saying to each other? One thing that's been observed about these connections is they tend to connect together units that have similar orientations. And there's also some evidence that those units are aligned collinearly, at least from ferret visual cortex. That's work from David Fitzpatrick's lab. So one idea is that, that these horizontal connections might be trying to do something like contour integration in images. And so Pierre Garrigue, a student at my lab, and I tried to see if we could capture this in a model by basically allowing horizontal connections among these coefficients. So the way we did this is by taking the analog coefficients and then conditioning each of them on a binary variable. So these variables S sub I are binary state variables, which condition these units here. So the binary variable Si here is 1. Then it allows this coefficient to be active with a Gaussian distribution. And if this unit is 0, then it forces that guy to be 0. And then we basically learned an Ising model among these binary units here to try to capture the pairwise dependencies among these oriented units here, and to see if we could learn sort of something like these contour association field statistics from natural scenes. And what we learned is actually shown down here. So these are basically what we're showing here is for each unit, the black line indicates the reference unit at a certain position orientation, and then these other bars indicate the other units that are connected to it. The color indicates the strength of connection, and then the position orientation indicates the position and orientation of that unit. So what you can see is these connections basically are basically connecting together units that are at similar positions and orientations. But it's not doing sort of what we thought it would do. It's not sort of forming contours or anything like that. So maybe that was kind of a lofty notion. So it's doing something, but I think to get these contour statistics out, you need a more complex model than just modeling pairwise dependencies. Yeah? Yep. Yes. Yeah, okay. So thanks for asking that to clarify. Okay, so what Geisler did here, he's plotted it in two different ways. Here, the color indicates simply the conditional probability of a unit being active, given that the unit in the center is active. What he did here is to normalize it in a kind of strange way. So you normalize it, the distribution within a circle here. So you fix the radius, and you fix the relative orientation. And then for all the different angles that you could be with respect to that unit, you normalize over all those different angles. And that's what gives you this kind of plot here, these co-circular statistics. So that might be part of the answer, right? Basically what the pairwise Ising model is going to learn from is just something like this, right? It's going to learn something like this structure. And as you observe, that's kind of what we get. And to get this kind of structure, yeah, you had to kind of normalize in this tricky way. So probably have to do something fancier in the model. And
now we expect it to depend on the data sets as well. But many data sets and natural images are very textury, and some of them
yes.
have much more
Yes, exactly, right. And I think this is one of the places where at least my intuitions, I was going to say our intuitions, but at least my intuitions were failing me. When I first started this work, one of the things I first started doing when I worked with David Field is to see if I could characterize these pairwise statistics of oriented elements and images, because I was just convinced we were going to be able to show that these association fields emerge from the statistics of natural images. But usually when I did it myself, I always got sort of histograms that looked like this. They didn't really look like contours. They sort of popped out of the images. And I think one reason why is exactly what you said, that introspectively we sort of look at images and we see all the contours and we say, ooh, wow, isn't that great? But really objectively, there's lots of texture there as well. And so when you mix this sort of bag of stuff together, the texture and the contour and then things that are sort of noise-like or whatever, that maybe these contour statistics are kind of weak. So maybe you have to, one possibility is you have to sort of condition them on the kind of structure you are in. You have to have like a conditional variable that says, well, am I on a contour, then do this, or am I in a texture, then do this. And there are these also these, cartoon plus texture models that people in the image processing community play with, which I think are related. So I guess all I want to say here is, it's more complicated than just pairwise statistics. All right. So that's the, at least, there's more to say certainly about group sparse coding, but I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So so finally I want to go into this topic of hierarchical models, how we can build multiple layers of representation that exploit these ideas of sparsity. And let's see, I had a point I was going to make with this next slide. But okay, so I guess one I think thing to bear in mind is what are we trying to do with these multiple layers of recognition, and what are we trying to model in the system? And I think one of the things I'm trying to do is sort of think about what these multiple layers of representation of the cortex are doing, much like Thomas and many other people have talked about. But that's not really the only way to do recognition. So I just want to mention the system has many ways, many pathways to do recognition, and one that Joseph Ledoux has talked about is this very fast pathway that goes to the amygdala. So it's well known in many creatures you can have these very fast reflexive behaviors in response to specific patterns or objects. And one well-known one in monkeys, if you show a monkey a snake that it's never seen before, it will freak out. Right, so it's never seen an infant monkey even, right? It's never seen a snake before in its life, but this is sort of somehow an innate pattern that is sort of built in. It's a very fast reaction to. And he's done these experiments in rat as well. Is if you show them rats these aversive stimuli, then you can record these very fast responses in the amygdala. And so one thing they theorize, there's a very fast pathway of getting there that goes just through the thalamus and then to the amygdala that's doing some form of object recognition or pattern recognition in images that's sufficient to elicit these reflexive responses. And maybe the midbrain as well might be an area that's involved in that. And then this thalamocortical system is something that evolved on top of the midbrain system. Okay, it was a much more recent development evolution. So all the reptiles, for instance, they just have midbrain. They don't have a thalamocortical system, right? And reptiles can do all kinds of navigation or object recognition and things with their brain. And so it's kind of interesting to speculate. Well, this thalamocortical system evolved on top of the midbrain system. So, well, what's it doing then? What's it doing kind of beyond what a midbrain can do, or over what sort of a thalamus amygdala system can do? And so I guess one way of thinking, I'm sort of thinking about this system is that it's forming a model of the world. It may be a sort of slower and clunkier system, but we're sort of trying to think about the models that it's forming of the world. Okay, so that's just kind of a little aside about maybe the cortical pathways. All right, so if we're going to then think about sort of building hierarchies of images, one thing, one maybe transition we're taking here is we started talking about coding, efficient coding principles, which is really just about transmitting information efficiently. We've talked about representation, so sparse coding is a form of representing system or reformatting system in a certain way. But what we really seek out of the system is understanding. We want a system that somehow understands what it sees. And I think in order to get these kinds of more meaningful representations of the world, we have to think a lot more about the structure of the generative model that we employ. I don't think we can just sort of expect to take some generic neural network architecture and then kind of crank the handle on it on some objective function and expect a miracle to pop out. We have to think a lot of scientists as scientists about what forms of structure do we want to capture in the data, and what are the necessary computations needed to do that. So as a demonstration of that, here's just a very simple example, I mean, almost elusively simple example, due to Ted Adelson of a block that's painted in 2 shades of gray. Okay, so anybody could look at this scene and understand what it means. Moreover, it's trivial to do the edge extraction from these images, right? You can easily extract a complete edge map and do segmentation, and you've got it. It's very easy. But you have a much bigger question ahead of you now to ask is, what does this mean? What do these contours and edges mean in this image, right? And it's a highly non-trivial problem when you think about it. So what Ted Adelson used this image for is to illustrate a certain illusion. The illusion that you see in this image is that this patch R appears to be much brighter than this patch P. So how many people see that? At least so I'm not the only one, unless you're seeing it correctly, yeah? Okay, so this patch R looks a lot brighter than this patch P, but in fact, they're exactly the same, okay? So if you just put a photometer on each of those points in the image, the actual luminance that you would measure there is exactly the same. So the reason why you're seeing that illusion actually makes sense, because you're trying to factor apart the shading from the reflectance. You want to know something about the physical properties of that object in the world, and you're trying to factor out these other sources of variation. And so one way of thinking about what's going on then is that you're taking this image and factoring it into these two different explanations. So one due to the reflectance or the paint on the object, and the other, the shading, which is due to the geometry, the three-dimensional geometry or shape of the object, right, and how it interacts with light. Okay, so when you look at this image here, you're sort of factoring into these two parts, and you do this completely effortlessly. Okay. So now, once you sort of see that, well then you go back to the image here, and now consider these two different edges. Consider the edge between P and Q here, right? This edge between P and Q is exactly the same as this edge between Q and R, except for the polarity. That's the only way in which they're different, right? Their contrast is exactly the same, and their orientation is exactly the same. Yet, these two edges mean completely different things, right? This edge between Q and R corresponds to a change in reflectance. This edge between P and Q corresponds to a change in geometry, or the three-dimensional shape of the object. There's yet a third type of edge in this image, which is the edge between the object and the background, right? It's obviously different contrast, but nevertheless, it's a very similar kind of edge. This edge here, it's oriented in the same way. That also means something completely different, right? So now consider, how a SIFT descriptor, like typically used in computer vision, would end up processing all this information. It's just going to sort of take all, a bunch of oriented filters, convolve with this image, and sort of collect it all together and make some sort of statistical measure out of it. But I would argue it has no understanding of what it's actually looking at, right? And that the problem is that simply just extracting orientations from a two-dimensional image is not enough to sort of tell you about the factors that you really want to know about the scene. So it still seems to me it's a very, very perplexing problem. Obviously it's not something you can do from a purely local computation. It requires some kind of a global computation. But what exactly do you need to do this? Okay, and this of course occurs in spades in real natural scenes. You have variations in reflectance and shading that conspire all over the place. And so we have to figure out how do you kind of factorize these things apart. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you about a model for doing that, but I will tell you about a model we've been working on for trying to factorize form and motion. Okay, and so this is a very similar related problem, and I'm going to try to convince you it has a similar kinds of computational structure. Oh, and I should mention here the computational structure here that's interesting is that in order to estimate, these different factors, right? If we want to estimate, is that due to shading or reflectance? Then you have to do these things simultaneously. You can't just have one thing that estimates reflectance and another thing that estimates shading, right? Because if you ascribe this edge here to a change in reflectance, at the same time, then you're saying it's not shading, right? And if you're saying that's shading, and then at the same time, you're saying it's not reflectance, okay? So there's a way in which these two things have to interact to account for the image structure. You have to estimate the two simultaneously. So what I'm going to try to argue here is that the computation of form and motion has a similar structure. So as we look at, you just sort of consider a day in the life of a time-varying image patch, a little patch of retina being analyzed by a patch of cortex. You see all these pixels changing over time. And so, what should we try to make of these patterns? So one thing you immediately observe is that when you just sort of look at this, you see these patterns that are relatively invariant, and they're simply just transforming or changing over time. So we want to somehow be able to capture that structure. So this is a problem that people in computer vision have addressed for a long time, and it just falls into what they typically refer to as motion estimation. So the traditional approach to motion estimation is one of computing optic flow, which is basically at each point in the image, tell me how the pixels are moving, in what direction in what direction, at what speed are they moving at each position. And so to do that, there's a very sort of elementary computation that people solve. It's known as the Horn and Schunck equation, or the constant brightness assumption. And the idea here, as shown here, is that you're comparing the image at one point in time to the image at another point in time. And you're trying to account for the difference between these images in terms of a shift in the image, right? You're saying, please find me, okay? You're trying to back out this parameter v, how they've shifted. Please find me an explanation of how these images are different in terms of a shift. What allows you to do that is your assumption that there's something about the world that's invariant. Okay, this is referred to as the constant brightness assumption, but it's really the constant pattern assumption, right? You're assuming that there's some pattern there in the image, and that pattern in the next instant of time is unchanged. And that I can compare the pattern at time 1 to the pattern at time 2 to compute how they've changed over time. I can't do this from a single pixel, obviously. Like just matching a single pixel is going to be way under constraint. I have to compare a pattern, okay? So what allows this to work is this assumption of invariance. Okay, the difference is, though, that what in this model, what they're assuming is invariant is the pixels, right? The pixel sort of representation is the sort of invariant description of the pattern, okay? So what we're going to argue here is there's a sort of different way of describing this, and this is sort of going to try to get at, as you're going to see, it's going to come to a very similar point as what Roland described to you earlier. Okay, so the idea here that what we're going to propose is that this problem of motion estimation really corresponds to a correspondence, solving a correspondence problem, as Roland mentioned. And I completely agree with Roland that I think the correspondence problem is really like one of the fundamental problems of vision, okay, that we have to sort of think about. But the idea here is that estimating the motion depends on assuming that there's some invariant form there, some invariant pattern that's present, okay? And at the same time, if you can model the transformation, like Roland was saying, right? If you can model the transformation, then invariance comes for free in a sense, right? You get invariance as a byproduct of that. Okay, so developing an invariant representation of the form comes from having a representation of the motion because we can essentially compensate for it. We can compensate these patterns over time as this image information comes in. We can compensate for the changes in position over time and accumulate an invariant representation of the pattern. Okay, so what allows us to achieve this invariance is modeling the transformation, and what allows us to compute the transformation of the motion is the assumption that there's something invariant there, an estimate of what that invariant form is. Okay, so the idea is that rather than just using the pixels for this, we're actually going to try to make a model of it. Okay, and that both of these things have to be regularized by some kind of a prior. Okay, we're going to try to derive this prior from natural scene statistics. So rather than the standard computer vision approach, where you simply use smoothness to regularize the solution of the motion, we're going to try to learn that prior from the statistics of natural scenes. And we're also going to try to learn a prior that regularizes the estimate of form. Okay, so that's the basic idea in a nutshell. So the overall model is shown here. So we're going to, I'll just sort of take you through it. You start with the image down here, and we start in the first layer with the sparse code of the image. And in the first layer, the sparse code is formed by complex basis functions, and those complex coefficients are factorized into amplitudes and phases. And once you have these first layer coefficients factorized in amplitudes and phases, then we simply train a second layer model on the amplitudes in the first layer and on the phases, on the phase derivatives in the first layer representation, and that forms the second layer representation. And the idea is that these representations we learn off the amplitudes, since they tend to be slowly varying over time, correspond to sort of more invariant or form aspects. We can learn representations of the form, and by learning on the time derivative of the phase, we can learn aspects of motion. Okay, and so I should point out a very strong similarity to exactly the architecture that Roland just mentioned, these factorized Boltzmann machines. There's a similar kind of factorization that occurs here, this times. Okay, this is basically a set of a weighted sum of the image pixels that's occurring here, a weighted sum of these latent variables here through these weights b, and another weighted sum of these guys here. And all these sort of weighted sums of different variables are coming together and being multiplied pointwise multiplicatively. They combine multiplicatively. Okay, so it has a very similar form in the end, actually, to the model that, that Roland told you about. The difference is here we're proposing this as a directed graphical model, and basically sort of arriving at a different point from sort of bottom up, sort of thinking about looking at the kind of statistical dependencies that we see in a sparse code and then trying to think about a good way of modeling them. And this is kind of the point we got to. Okay, so for the first layer, we use a sparse coding model, and rather than a sparse coding model of real basis functions, I'm just going to have to sort of zap through this really kind of quickly. We use a sparse coding model based on complex functions, and okay, so the idea is shown here. So we describe the time-varying image as as a product of complex coefficients together with complex basis functions phi sub I. So each of these basis functions has a real part and an imaginary part, and each of the coefficients has also a real and imaginary part, or you can alternatively describe it simply as an amplitude and its complex phasor. Okay, when you multiply these two out and just take the real part, what you get is basically a subspace model. You can think of this as a subspace sparse coding model where the subspace is a size 2. Okay, and so you have a common amplitude, which is multiplying common amplitude variable sigma I, which is multiplying each of these basis functions. And then the phase here essentially acts as an interpolating variable, right? It's telling you the relative contribution of the real part as opposed to the imaginary part. Okay? Okay, so the reason to invoke this sort of complex representation is not necessarily to model what complex cells are doing. It's a mathematically complex mathematical representation, and it's really the point is really sort of to get a factorization of these coefficients into amplitude and phase to basically try to capture this bubble-like behavior that Apu Huvarinen observed. Okay, so the model in the first layer then with these complex coefficients, we impose a sparse and slow prior on these amplitudes and then trained it on movies. So note that these basis functions are purely spatial. There's no temporal component on them. We're just imposing slowness or temporal stability on these amplitudes here. Okay, so when you train this model on natural movies, then it learns basically pairs of basis functions which are related in position and orientation and have just slightly different phases. Okay, so each quadrant here, a group of 4 patches shows you the top 2, the real and imaginary parts, and the bottom 2, the complex modulus and the phase of the basis function. And as more easily illustrated when you just animate the function. So here what we're doing is for just a set of the functions learned on 32 by 32 patches. I believe in this case we're holding the amplitude of the basis function at 1 and spinning the phase from 0 to pi. Actually, I'm sorry, the amplitude is sort of ramps up and then ramps down. Okay. Okay, so one way to think about what the first layer is doing is has this set of complex basis functions, and it's trying to align these basis functions with the manifold of natural scenes. Okay, this contiguous manifold of natural images, and each of these complex basis functions forms a 2-dimensional subspace. So it's trying to align these 2-dimensional subspaces with the manifold so that it can keep the amplitude of that subspace as invariant as possible over time in response to the movies that it sees. Okay, so this is what it decides is an efficient representation to do that. Okay, and then once you have it in this form, it turns out then you basically allow it to expose these statistical dependencies that exist among the amplitudes and among the phases. So I'm going to have to jump ahead here. I'm sorry, real quick. I'll just try to give you the gist of it. Okay, so we do this factorization from the complex basis functions in the first layer to this factorization to amplitude and phase, and now we're going to try to learn these second layer weights on the amplitudes and phases that were extracted from the first layer. Okay, and then to do the learning, we impose both slowness or temporal coherence and sparseness on these second layer variables v and w. Okay, so what I want to show you now is these second layer weights b and d, but that's somewhat challenging because as opposed to these weights down here, these weights live in the image domain, right? So they're very easy to visualize what they mean. These weights here live in the space of these first layer coefficients. So what I'm going to visualize what's learned in these weights here, I have to have a way of visualizing these units here. And so the way we do that is by taking each of these basis functions in the first layer and showing where it resides in the space domain. So this particular complex basis function, it's from its complex modulus, it's here in the space domain. And the Fourier domain, it has a particular orientation and spatial frequency which it's selected to. So it has this particular point in the spatial frequency domain, which indicates its orientation and spatial frequency selectivity. So the whole set of learned functions basically tiles both of these spaces, the spatial domain and the spatial frequency domain. So now we have a way of displaying the weights of one of those second layer units. We can simply color each of these dots according to the strength of the weight learned in the second layer. Okay, so we're going to display it on the color scale where gray is 0, essentially means it's disconnected. Red means positive weights and blue means negative weights. Okay, so for this particular weight, weight vector here, this would be a unit that's sort of broadly connected to all the units at different positions, but with a specific pattern in spatial frequency and orientation, which I'll get to in a moment. Okay. So let's first go through the form components, these weights B, which are basically learning from the amplitudes of these complex basis functions in the first layer. And this is just showing you sort of a sampling. There's about 100 basis functions that are learned in the second layer. So we're just showing you six of them here, kind of anecdotally, but they're representative of the sort of variety of different functions that we see in the population that are learned. So this particular function is, it's basically what we would call, or correspond to like a texture component. It's combining a bunch of basis functions in this region positively and a bunch of basis functions in this region negatively. Okay? And if you sort of look at kind of what it ends up corresponding to in natural scenes, if these are just showing you sort of image patches that give the largest positive response and image patches that give you the largest negative response for that particular unit. So it's coding something like we might loosely call texture boundaries. A more interesting example would be this function here. So this is coding something maybe analogous to contours. So if you look at what this function is doing, it's taking a bunch of units which in the Fourier domain all reside at one orientation. So these are all a bunch of units that are oriented in the same way. And in the space domain, we see that they're all aligned collinearly at that same orientation. Okay? So a bunch of units with the same orientation, you're sort of combining collinearly. And if we look at the units that positively activate that unit, then they correspond indeed to contours that have that sort of going through that region of the image. Okay? And then there's other units here that are looking like, let's say, at orientation gradients, and they're going to sort of exhibit what people in neurophysiology call cross-orientation inhibition, so, sort of opposition from different neighboring orientations, and sort of a variety of different structures that correspond basically to the sort of invariant form, so that the things that it seems to be invariant over time in natural images. And then similarly, then we learned from the derivative, the time derivative, the phases in this model. Those are shown here. Just again a sampling of them. So this particular unit is connected globally across space to all the units in the first layer. And now if we look in the Fourier domain, we see that it has a very particular structure in the Fourier domain where it increases, the weights increase as a function of spatial frequency in this direction and decrease negatively as a function of spatial frequency in this direction. Okay, so remember that this function is learned in the phase derivative, so it's essentially telling how much of the phase to spin on each of these complex basis functions. So it's telling these phases of the high spatial frequencies to spin a lot, and these units at lower spatial frequencies to spin less. So what this corresponds to basically is uniform translation. So if things are sort of uniformly moving through the image patch, then you would expect the high spatial frequency functions to spin rapidly and the lower spatial frequency functions to spin less. And the rate at which they spin is simply proportional to their spatial frequency. Okay? So another way of visualizing this unit is as basically an optic flow diagram. We can take a test pattern and have the model basically perturb that pattern over time to show you basically the flow fields that it corresponds to that it's learned. So this particular unit is learned translation of the entire image patch. But interestingly, you have to sort of tile all these directions of motion, right? Because within any given image patch, let's say, I think these were 20 by 20 image patches that we trained from here. you're not going to have, in general, uniform motion throughout the image patch, right? So things are going to be moving locally in different parts of the image patch in different ways. So a lot of the units have this sort of localized motion structure where they code translation just in one part of the image patch, but leave other units to code the transformation in the other part of the patch. This particular unit seems to be coding something like shear, sort of moving things in different directions, and this something more like rotation. Okay, so there's a whole variety of different functions that come out of this. And I should mention, this is also, going back to this issue of image compression, this is one of the issues that people who do image compression have to think about and deal with when they do motion compensation, right? Because typically the way MPEG is done, the default block size is like a 16 by 16 image patch, right? And they try to estimate the motion over a 16 by 16 image patch. So if the motion is uniform within that patch, that's going to work great, right? But if you have differential motion within that image patch, it's not going to work very well, right? So one of the things they do is actually what's called mode decomposition, where they do basically a tree search, looking for the most efficient tiling for each particular image, right? So they're saying, well, should I describe this as one big 16 by 16, or as 4 8 by 8s, or as 16 4 by 4s, or whatever, right? So all these various combinations of how you could sort of tile that space. And one way to think about this system is that's what it's basically doing. It's learning how to tile the space of these different sort of motion operators as they occur in an image. Okay, and this is just showing you the generative aspect of the model. So since it's a generative model, we can sort of tip it on its head and have it synthesize what it thinks these different motion components correspond to. So the way we do this is by putting in a static image patch, inferring the amplitudes and phases for that image patch, and then we take the phases and spin them back and forth by one of these particular components. We take one unit up here and we simply toggle it between 1 and -1, and that will move that image patch according to that transformation. So the important thing to note here, also as Roland noted as well, is that it's learning the transformation independent of the content. Okay, so it's abstracted away this idea of motion independent of the form that it's connected to. Okay, so it's learned how to generalize or factorize this thing apart as an independent thing. So once it has this idea of motion of the transformation, it can apply that to any spatial structure that comes along. And the same thing for these form components. That's a very complementary structure. Those form components that I showed you can be applied independent of what the transformation or motion is in the image. Okay, and here's showing you where the localized ones. So this is just moving the things in the bottom part of the image patch, learning the top part. Top part static. So all these things are merging because it's deciding this is a good way to tile that domain of form and motion. Okay, so I'm a bit over, so I'm going to kind of just wrap up, and there's a bunch more to say here, but okay, so maybe I'll just end on this a point here and just try to sort of wrap up a lot of the things I've talked about between these two different talks. So we sort of went through and talked about all of these different ways of trying to model statistics in natural images, from contrast histograms and correlations, the correlation function of the image, using sparseness to try to capture higher order statistics, and then these models of amplitude components and phase components, and so forth. And maybe sort of the properties. Here's my sort of attempt to maybe summarize the kinds of properties that you're extracting from these different forms of image statistics, and possibly the different layers that they're coded at. So I think we can first identify places where these coding schemes and types of representations might be relevant. And so one of the things we hope to do is use now these amplitude components and phase components that we learn from the model and see if we can use those as better predictors for activity in higher visual areas like V2 and in area MT, but that's work still ahead of us. All right, well, thanks very much.